Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight for the University of St. Francis Lecture Series here at ACPL. Tonight, we welcome returning lecturer Dr. Buttram of the Keith Bussey School of Business, Division Director and Assistant Professor of Management. Please welcome Dr. Buttram.
Thank you, and good evening. And I thank you so much for braving the weather this evening and coming out and hearing a presentation that will be part current events, part history, talk a little bit about the future. This is my third consecutive year of participating in the Allen County Public Library Lecture Series. And 2 years ago, when we started this, it was the middle of COVID, and I talked about the China and the New World Economy. And about a year ago, I talked about, gave a presentation on the Artemis moon mission. And it's kind of prescient because today we'll have a little bit of talk about that and about the liftoff and the actual start of that. But today, this presentation is about, and I titled it purposely, a most consequential Fortune 500 company. I worked with the word invisible, subliminal, but I like the word consequential because this piece of real estate that is the Pentagon and what it does has reverberations around the world. So what I'd like to do is this outline here, and you give me about 40 minutes, and it's going to cover quite a bit. I'll try to keep it conversational such that it doesn't get too dense. But I really want to follow each one of these bullets in sequence. We're going to talk about the military-industrial complex, what that is, how the Pentagon came to be, some of the defense contractors that you may know or heard of, but really what drives the U.S. Defense Department and how the Pentagon has become that consequential company. Talk about proximity wars, or the short term you may have heard proxy wars, and how those have really factored in over the last 100 years as to what business the Pentagon is really in. Some strategies, there's a status quo antebellum, which is a Latin term for essentially status quo and put things the way they were. Nothing really changes. I will talk somewhat at length about World War I and some of its foundations and some of the legacies and how what occurred over 100 years ago has laid the groundwork for what the Pentagon does today. Of course, we're going to talk about Ukraine this evening because much of what you see and hear is being played out on the fields and on the countryside of Ukraine. And I'll talk about future proxy wars, and then I'll conclude it with some questions. So to get started, the Pentagon itself, it looks small in this picture, of course, but it's actually the largest office building in the world. It's not in Washington, D.C. It's in Arlington, Virginia, right across the river. And the shape of it came from the 5 services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and the Coast Guard. The Pentagon itself, you may not know, but it's really not that old. So it was actually began construction at the beginning of World War II, because where the War Department was housed, it was not large enough, and it certainly was not going to be big enough and efficient enough for what the U.S. was working with in World War II. They actually built the Pentagon in about 2 years, and it was completed in 1943. Of course, this has many upgrades since then, but this aerial view here gives you an idea of the sheer size of it. I've had the opportunity to be in there twice. I don't really want to go back to it. It's really quite busy, and you will get lost, but it houses over 30,000 employees, shops, centers, mall, you name it. The Pentagon is its own company, the largest office building in the world. When we talk about stakeholders in a company, we're talking about those who have an interest in the business. So when we talk about stakeholders for The Pentagon, we're really talking about those who make up the services, the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, the Marines, and what we call the Coasties, the Coast Guard personnel. So shareholders are those who own a piece of the firm. And if you don't know who that is, that's all of us sitting in this room. Those are taxpayers. So we fund everything that the Pentagon does, believe it or not, with tax dollars. Every airplane, every tank, every bolt, every screw, anything that leaves our shores to go somewhere else, we pay for that. We're a shareholder. So who are the board of directors in this company? Well, you may have heard of the service chiefs, the Army Chief of Staff, the Navy Chief of Staff, Marine Corps Commandant, Coast Guard Chief of Staff. Each service has its own Chief of Staff, and it's usually a 4-star general. It is a 4-star general or a full admiral. And then each service also has a service secretary, a civilian, and that's the board. They get their cues, so to speak, from the President and the Secretary of Defense. So this company, this corporation, is most consequential because of what it procures, produces, and sells. You may not have heard of this term, but the military-industrial complex was actually given its name by President Eisenhower in his farewell speech in 1961. And so President Eisenhower had, at the time, as you can imagine, participated in quite a bit of American history. So he was in World War I. You know he was in World War II, two-term president. He ended the Korean War, and he saw the rise of what the Pentagon came to be. So as president from 1952 to 1960, and in the beginnings of the Cold War and the space race, this 16-minute video, or his speech, was really far-reaching, and we're really dealing with what he defined back in 1961. So what is the military-industrial complex? His warning was that if we're not careful as a society, that the military can become the driver of not every, but most of the companies and businesses, public and private, in our country. And you won't know it. And so here comes the invisibility of what the Pentagon does. So at the beginning of this, I meant to state that I'm speaking from a position of one that's been in the military. I'm retired from the Army, so I don't have a left or right-leaning piece to this, but I really do enjoy talking about history, current events, and the impacts of what those two mean. So President Eisenhower was, if you have the opportunity, you can see it on YouTube, 16-minute speech, very powerful, and scared a lot of people, and it still scares a lot of people today, because what he's talking about is what the future was in 1961, and it's come back all the time in the last 60 years. In World War II, at the time, we were neutral, 1939. This was before Pearl Harbor. And so at the time, France and Britain and really were getting run over France was, by the Germans in World War II. England was kind of cut off as an island itself. So if we're a neutral country, we could not directly sell arms to another country without being implicit or complicit in the war, and then the Germans declaring war on us, so to speak. So what do? President Roosevelt had a policy, and he gave it to France and England first. You can buy all the arms you want from us, but you have to give us cash. And oh, by the way, after you buy them, you've got to ship them over to where you need them. Our hands are clean. It was called cash and carry, part of the Neutrality Act in 1939. Well, the war got worse. France got overrun in 1940, and England became more and more isolated. And so President Roosevelt tightened the screws, so to speak, and got through Congress what was called the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. And so what that really did was that I can lend you a tank, or I can lease you a tank. I just can't sell it to you. And I can give it and I can ship it to you. So does that make the U.S. any more complicit in what we were doing? Is that any different than cash and carry? It was. Because we not only lend-leased to England and France, we lent military supplies to Russia and other European countries, all in this proxy of fighting the Germans without actually declaring war on them. The fourth bullet there, I told you a little bit about President Eisenhower, but 100 years before that, we all know of the Gettysburg Address. But both of these presidents, 100 years apart, there were some comparisons in their speech. President Lincoln spoke for 15 minutes. And there were a lot of disappointed people that day because they thought the president was going to talk at length. He talked very briefly about what America had experienced, what it was going to provide for the country after the war, and what the soldiers did for the country. It was really quite poignant, but it was very simple. And what he was really talking about was, in context, what America really does for itself and for the world. At that particular time in the Civil War, France and England were just begging to get into who were they going to help. The British were going to help the North, the French were going to help the South. And had it not been for Gettysburg and a couple other battles, we may have had a different outcome. The French and the British were ready to support either side. Coming over to America and participating in our Civil War. Not much unlike what we did 50, 60 years later with President Eisenhower, or President Roosevelt. So Eisenhower in 1961 and Lincoln in 1863 really were talking about events far beyond when they were speaking them. Hard and soft power. Hard power is military. Soft power is diplomacy. So there's two trains of thought, and it really runs through the veins of the Pentagon. So you use hard power because soft power just doesn't work. You give soft power all the chance, the diplomats, diplomacy, you give it all the chance you get, and then you have to use hard power. Or it could be reversed. The State Department thinks that there is no need for war because soft power, you can negotiate away anything, and therefore you don't need to fight. But that's an interesting dichotomy, and as we talk a little bit here about man himself and how we get to the point of fighting, it talks about, we're going to talk about what the Pentagon does. So Ukraine and proxy wars and support, I'm going to show you a slide here about how much we actually spend on arms and sales. You're going to be a little bit surprised. But Ukraine plays hard and fast in the presentation this evening because it really speaks to what President Eisenhower was talking about 60 years ago, and it still exists here today. My last bullet there, if you know anything about the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire, Rome simply sent their legions, and their legions did their bidding. So the first one there, and you can conquer, and you have the high ground, so to speak, well, then the Roman legions conquered that particular country. They did that all through Europe. Julius Caesar, it's all there in history. So the Romans at the time didn't have anything that we had. They couldn't sell arms. They couldn't barter, lend-lease. They just came in your country and took it. And now you look down here at Arlington, Virginia, and it's the exact opposite. We don't have to send our military anywhere. We can simply send arms and supplies and equipment to do the same thing. And that's exactly what's occurring today. I'd like to take a look at this slide right here. There are 2 years, and of course we don't have the 2022 stats yet, but these are the top 10 defense contractors in America. You look on the left side, every one of the contractors is military with the exception of Boeing. You all may think Boeing just simply makes civilian airliners, but no, they make combat jets, all types of defense equipment. It is a completely different part of Boeing than the one you may be accustomed to. Now, that was just 2 years ago. If you look to the right, in the areas that are highlighted, you see General Dynamics in 2021 was not on the top 10 in 2020. Neither were the companies in yellow. 3 of those in yellow aren't even military companies. They're pharmaceuticals. So we know what happened in 2021, COVID. What you may not know is that Moderna, Pfizer, whatever the other COVID vaccines were, created here in our country and sold across the world. So could Pfizer and Moderna, Regeneron, Humana sell those vaccines directly to other countries? They could have, but they didn't. So they were sold through a third party, and that third party was the Pentagon. And so this is why you see in 2021 how Humana, Moderna, Regeneron, billions of dollars in sales because their third party supply chain management conduit was the Pentagon. So who makes the money between the third party? If I make a vaccine and I'm using someone else to supply it to a third party, does the middleman make any money? Of course. And so what you're seeing here on the right is what the company profited and what the gross was. But what you won't see, and what you probably will never see, is how much we, the taxpayer, and the Pentagon made as a middleman. So I wonder actually what this will look like, what the top 10 will be when December 31st comes. Lockheed Martin is probably the top one will probably be the top one for a long time. The reason why you see General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman in there is that all these companies, but particularly those 2 in Lockheed Martin, are really involved in spacecraft, the space race, everything associated with space. And so space has become militarized. You don't see that on the news, you don't sense it, but all these defense contractors are in the middle of producing and creating all the hardware and the software to get us from here, Earth orbit, to the moon, to Mars. So what's interesting about this is the Pentagon itself asks itself 5 questions. The who, what, when, where, and why. So whenever and when I say we, we're talking the Pentagon. Who ultimately benefits from what we're selling? What should we export? We can't sell everything to everyone. I'll get a little further down. We don't sell everything to Ukraine. You can't sell everything that you have because of what it is and sensitive items and secrecy and things, but you sell what the third party needs. Where lies the justification for whatever you're going to sell, whatever you're going to offer? Who provides that justification? And when will the sales end and begin? So since February of this year, we have been supplying Ukraine with a lot of artillery, air defense weapons, surface-to-air missiles. And it seems like every other week we're offering another multi-million-dollar package of aid, military aid, to Ukraine. The last stat I have in here in the paper that I wrote on this is we're at about $18.9 billion of aid to Ukraine since February. That's military aid. But another 50, 55 billion in humanitarian aid. And so to put that in context, over 6 months, is it a drop in the bucket? It is. So I watched the Artemis mission this morning and listened to commentator talk about the cost of one of those flights. And so the trip that's going to the moon and back over the next 3 weeks is $4 billion over 3 weeks. So is $18.9 billion a lot over 6 months? If you don't know, you don't put it in context, it just seems like a lot of money. But maybe it's not. It's been 6 months. How long are we going to continue to supply it? Okay. The last question is, how will it impact the future? I don't think anyone can foretell when this war will end. Or is it even a war? Are we in a war? We being the U.S. Are we in some kind of conflict that we cannot get out? Are we trying to prevent something from becoming larger than what it is? And how does the Pentagon always find itself in the middle of this? Hold that thought. So is the Pentagon invisible or is it subliminal? So we know what invisibility is, you just can't see it. Or is it more subliminal? Is it just right below the consciousness? Everyone here knows what the Pentagon is. Everyone's heard of it. But you don't really have an idea of what it does until there's some type of conflict. And then all of a sudden you're hearing Defense Department spokespersons talking about this or talking about that. But from day to day, everyday operations, it's not much different than Microsoft or Google or GM. You just assume that the Pentagon is doing what the Pentagon does. What's interesting about the slide, 2 slides before, Boeing, you may not know, Boeing has enough clout in enough money in the U.S. business realm that if they have a bad day, it directly affects the stock market. If they have a good day, it directly affects it. So the other piece you may not know is like Google, Amazon, Facebook, all the tech companies directly affect the NASDAQ. The Pentagon has really not control, but it has pieces of all of this. If it had its own stock market ticker, it'd probably be larger than Google and Amazon, Facebook, Twitter combined, but it doesn't. It's just not made up like that, but it works like that. That last bullet there, media versus obscurity. Again, all of us here lived through the Iraq War and the media coverage in that. We lived through the Afghanistan War. We saw us leave a little over a year ago. When there's conflict, the media provides attention to it. And then you have some kind of idea what the military and what the services and what the Pentagon is really doing. But when there's not a conflict, it's obscurity. But it's always affecting everything that we do. 3 types of strategy that we have here in the U.S. National, political, and economic. The big piece of this is the middle bullet. The political strategy really is the wherewithal with what our country wants to do. So if I were to take a temperature question to everyone here and asked, do you think we should have gotten involved in Ukraine? Were there any other options? Do you think we should have gotten involved in Iraq? Keep going back. Do you think we ever should have gotten involved in Vietnam? Korea. Hold on to Korea. I won't go back any further than that because that's a very important starting point, actually. But politics plays more with the other 2 national strategy and economic strategy than you can imagine. So politics involves, particularly with the Pentagon, money. So the Pentagon has a budget every year. The services ask for this, they ask for that. They hardly ever get what they want fully. Sometimes they get more than what they ask for. But most of the time, they don't get what they ask for. So they have to make do, like everyone else here, with what you get. And so the military is perpetually behind, but you would not know that. But even though it's behind, even though we're budgeted to the point where you may not be able to do two things at once, you wouldn't know that unless we got into a conflict and we needed to do two things at once. Economic strategy, the last piece on this is the world now is so interconnected economically that it's hard to imagine that there will be another type of world war that we've seen. Is it feasible? Why would we do that? Any conflict, Ukraine affects just about every country in the world, and it's being felt. Ukraine was, at one time, was the top wheat exporter in the world. And their wheat goes to Africa, and it goes to Indonesia, and they have not been able to get their wheat out since, or this year. And that has global effects. Economic effects, it goes around. Russia has now cut off gas to Germany, Poland, Western Europe. And it's cold out here right now, but come December, January, and there's not enough natural gas to go around in those countries, you can see conflicts cause consequences. Our national, political, and economic strategies don't always align because the bill of bullet there is what really drives the other two. Let me tell you real briefly what a proxy war is, because this is what we've really been doing since 1950, and it really won't much change, and it won't much change how the Pentagon operates. So a proximity war is really you have two powers who don't really want to, they can't, or they won't, or they can't afford to actually have a conflict between them, each other. So they use some country, some people, some territory to use their equipment to fight their larger battle. That's what the Cold War was. When you look at this slide right here, remember the Soviet War in Afghanistan, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, all those are proxy wars. The Ukraine war is a proxy war that's happening right in front of us. Proxy wars have become the standard. They have become the stalemate. And that question right there, under what circumstances should the U.S. intervene with other countries or in other countries or other nations? Depending on who's in the political strategy piece again, that answer could change every 2 years. At least every 2 years, or really every 4 years. At what point do I say I'm going to commit more than what I do under the surface? These two questions will lead me into the last part of the presentation, and that is the State Department, who is the definition of soft power, or is the Pentagon the definition of hard power? Actually, which one of those are providing the preventative diplomacy model, particularly after Iraq and Afghanistan? This is a completely different world, really, since August of 2021 when we left Afghanistan. But who is driving this? Do you ever hear the State Department or have any statements from Foggy Bottom, which is where the State Department is headquartered in D.C.? Do you ever hear anything from the State Department? You don't, because they're all over the world. They're preventing a lot of things that we don't see. But what you do hear about is when soft power simply does not work. And then you hear about the Pentagon. But is the Pentagon actually driving everything? Or does diplomacy still work? I want to talk very briefly here about World War I. What's interesting about World War I, and I've talked about this a few times, written about it quite a bit. It's a very interesting cartoon right here. You can't read the statement below, but that's Uncle Sam. That's Germany on the right, and who's standing in the back is England. And what they're really talking about is chess moves and who's going to get what territory after a conflict. It's a very interesting cartoon, putting in the context as countries make power plays, and we have been doing this really since World War I. Very briefly, what we're dealing with nowadays is annexation. And annexation is, I want a piece of your territory because either I had it before or I want what you have, and you won't give me what I want. I'm being very simple here. But if you're not going to do that, I'm just going to annex it. And right here in Fort Wayne, it's not much different than the Fort Wayne city proper annexing a portion of Allen County. Some people are in uproar sometimes. Well, you just can't annex. You just can't take. It's eminent domain. We need it because of A, B, and C. That's annexation. And that's kind of where we are today. Manifest destinies and recurring fallacies. The next two slides will give you historical perspective of how we got to where we are today. That last bullet there, what we're dealing with today are the Russian and Chinese, a different type of colonialism. And we're really talking about economics. No one wants to use nuclear weapons. No one wants to fight huge global battles, much like World War I and World War II. Even though we can, we don't. Diplomacy comes in when you can put a sanction on somebody, or you can put a blockade on somebody, or you can refrain from giving natural gas to somebody. And it's just not going to affect that particular country. It's going to affect 4 or 5 other countries. There are a lot of things that are occurring around the world that's affecting the U.S., Ukraine, Taiwan, that you just don't sense and feel. But you can if the screwdrivers turn a little bit and you're pinched a little bit. How do we get here? Very interesting slide right here. If you look in the middle, if you know anything about World War I history, we're talking 1914. We're talking 100 years ago, which is not that long. Okay, we're talking 4 or 5 generations ago. It's not very long ago. But just like in World War II, we wanted to stay out of it. I want you to look at the middle of that slide and look at Serbia and Bulgaria. Look on the left, and use Italy, Austria, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is Turkey now, is Turkey, okay? All those were empires. To the right, Russia, France, Britain, they were empires. So what started World War I wasn't a Serbian national assassinating arch friend Ferdinand in Austria. That really didn't start war. It didn't start World War I. World War I was started 30 years before, the prep for it. When all of these countries here, and some you don't see, were actually having a proxy war over the entire continent of Africa. I'll explain that here in a second. I want to read something about Hobbes here. Hobbes was I don't want to call him an ancient philosopher because he was in the 1600s, right up there around the time of Shakespeare, but he was a modern day at the time political philosopher. And I want to read something very interesting in a book that he wrote called Leviathan. It's just a very short blurb. The nature of war consists of not in fighting, but in the assurance of the contrary. What does that mean? That means men's nature are to quarrel, but they want peace. So human beings are naturally want to quarrel. He actually says there are 3 pieces to man. 3 pieces. They compete, they're diffident, and they want glory. But to achieve that, what they really want is peace. But in order to get those three, you have to fight. And it was really interesting philosophical context about man in general, that man is not at peace unless he's at war trying to obtain the peace. So what is that? Is that just a vicious circle, or is it just a 1600 version and definition of a stalemate? You all have probably heard of Henry Kissinger. So Henry Kissinger was 99 years old. He's still writing books. He's still talking. He's still cogent. And Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, National Security Advisor under President Nixon and President Ford, one of the architects to end the Vietnam War, won the Nobel Peace Prize, but he's also been quite controversial. But he's a diplomat, not a philosopher. He's not a war fighter. He's a war ender, if you listen to him enough and you read enough about him. But Henry Kissinger really was more of a philosopher, much like Hobbes was. And Hobbes, when you listen to him, is more like a statesman. Statesmen understand that negotiation is not going to work 100% of the time because man won't allow it. Kissinger, I know peace will work, but I understand man has to fight out what he wants to fight out. Vietnam, he helped to end it. He helped secure the peace accords. But the way he did it and the way he won the Nobel Peace Prize for it was not well received. So diplomats, philosophers, what man is and what man does is very interesting. I want you to look at this map real quick. From 1884 to 1914, this is called the Scramble for Africa. If you can see all these countries and all the color, in all the European countries who partitioned Africa 30 years before the first bullet flew in Europe. So World War I was fought on Europe, but it was really fought over Africa and Asia and India. And the fight started here over dominion and power. And the unfortunate part about 100 years ago was there was no power broker to stop this. There was no League of Nations, there was no United Nations, there was no responsible statesperson to say, we're not going to do this. 30 years before World War I ever occurred, started right here in Africa. All these European countries wanted a piece of something that they thought would bring them dominion and power, and ended up creating a global conflict that killed millions. Now look at the comparison to Ukraine. If you were to look at that map, superimpose Ukraine over it, what are the comparisons? So in 2014, Russia decided to annex parts of Ukraine that it had already given away to Ukraine decades before that. They wanted it back, so they took it. Crimea, the far eastern regions of Ukraine, and then in February 2020, they just decided, well, you're not working fast enough to give us what we want. We're just going to take it, and they decided to do that. And here is a map of Ukraine. I'm sure many of you have seen these maps, seen them on the news in the last 6 months. What's interesting, and let me use my pointer here, this area here, which is the Far East, you've probably heard of the Donbass region and the bombings and everything in this area right here. What you may not know is that area was given to the Russians by the Ukrainians after World War II. The Ukraine said, okay, have it. But then they gave it back. You know, the Soviet Union imploded in 1991. and became Russia, and Russia wanted it back. It took them another 14 years or so, to 2014, to take Crimea. This thing's in French, I believe. Odessa. This sea right here, this is the Black Sea. It leads down to the Mediterranean, down here to Constantinople, which is Turkey. Yesterday, or 2 days before, there was really some big news about some artillery and killing 2 farmers here in Poland. Come to find out, it wasn't the Russians, it was the Ukrainians trying to defend against a 100-missile barrage from the Russians, way over here in east. Here's the capital, Kiev. Where'd it go? This is Kiev. This entire country, you're probably wondering, why in the world are we fighting over a country that's so far away from us? If you know anything about geography, look where the red is. This is Ukraine. And this is Russia. What does Russia not have that Ukraine does? Because it's really as simple as that. It has a port, the Black Sea, Odessa, where it can export all of its wheat. It was the #1 wheat exporting country in the world, leading us before 2014. It wants to be part of NATO. NATO doesn't want it because they don't want to anger the Russians. The Russians won't let them join NATO, otherwise they're going to invade their country, and that's exactly what they did. But now, we're in this Korean War example. And I'm going to close this up in just a second here. I've had the opportunity to live in Korea for 2 years. I've actually been to what's called the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. Runs across the entire country. This is North Korea. This is South Korea. To this day, the Korean War has not ended. There is no end of the Korean War. There never was a truce. This started, and it was a fight between U.S. and North Korean forces. In 3 years, we ended up really fighting the Chinese on the ground, fighting the Russians in the air, until President Eisenhower became president and said, we're going to end this, or I'm going to nuke the country. And that was really that simple. This is before he became president. He campaigned on it to end the Korean War. He ended it in 1953. And if you watch enough news, the North Koreans are probably the most hermit country in the world, but they're a nuclear power. And that's all they really have. South Korea is the size of Indiana, but is the 13th largest economy in the world. But the stalemate, the status quo antebellum, still exists here, and every war since then that has occurred is the same way. The Suez Crisis in 1956, the Vietnam War, the Six-Day Israel-Arab War, the Yom Kippur War, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and the Afghanistan War. Who won those? Who won those? Did anyone win? No. They were all proxy wars. Each one of those wars were between two combatants who never really fought each other. And at the time, that was the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And who paid for that? Who led that was the Pentagon. And in 1961, as I circle this back around, President Eisenhower was exactly right, that if we do not get control of the military-industrial complex, and what he was really talking about was the Pentagon, it will continue to lead the American economy by a leash. We can have proxy wars and have this status quo forever. I don't know when the Ukrainian conflict will end. I know we've committed almost $19 billion in military aid. We've given them equipment that have depleted our supplies of equipment we need. On our side, Germans, Polish, Israelis, South Koreans are supplying equipment. On the Russian side, guess who's supplying equipment? The Chinese and the Iranians. Iranian drones, Chinese moral support. Chinese won't give weapons, but they give advice. Do you see this proxy war between great powers that really don't want to fight each other, but they will certainly, over a strip of land the size of the DMZ or a country the size of Ukraine, so that one has a chess move in the long term over the other? Okay. When we talk resources, human, natural, potential, and unknown, I want you to hold that and understand our future. These are all possible proxy wars. This is a very interesting map because Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, you can see all of this in the Indo-Pacific. All of that is in the realm of what China says that they want to influence. A democracy. It's communist, but it's capitalist now, Vietnam. The Philippines is a democracy. This sea right here, the South China Sea, China claims it owns it. It doesn't. By international rules and regulations, China doesn't. No one owns any part of the sea unless it's 100 miles from your coast. They claim they own this whole thing. Therefore, they can protect it. How does the Pentagon deal with that? How does the Pentagon deal with something half a world away where a country's threatening all three of these countries at the same time? The Arctic. Just read a report today that we are like 10 years behind the Russians in equipment and bases and supplies in the Arctic. So if you're a climate change individual, ice is melted in the Arctic. You can actually, in some places, actually take a ship and go from point A to point B when you couldn't do it before. But the Russians have more equipment up there than we ever have, and we can't beat them. We cannot. It will take 10 years to equal what they already have there. That's another front. The Panama Canal is another. I think it was 20 years ago, we gave the Panama, and I think it was a little longer than that, we gave the Panama Canal back to, it was in Jimmy Carter's era, gave the Panama Canal back to Panama. And do you know that the Chinese are trying to buy it? Now, what would that do if an adversary, we'll call it an adversary, had control of the Panama Canal? Interesting. Taiwan, you've heard that in the news. There's all kind of ominous signs and what China may do, what we may do to defend an island that we really don't know anything about, other than Ukraine was the #1 wheat exporter in the world. Do you know what Taiwan is #1 in the world? Rhetorical question. Superconductors, chips, all kind of chips. They're the #1 makers of computer chips. The #1 in the world. This island. That's why China wants it. Taiwan was once part of China, just like Ukraine was once part of the Soviet Union. They split. They didn't want to go back. China wants it back. Russia wants the Ukraine back. We help prevent that. We're helping to prevent it, and that's one of the things the Pentagon does. The last thing I'll say here, and this is really future-oriented, 2 o'clock this morning, I was up and I watched the Artemis moon mission launch. And it was very interesting. Couldn't see too much, it was dark. But it took Well, a year ago, I talked about the Artemis mission right in here. And it finally went off on the first mission 2 o'clock this morning. So this particular Artemis 1 mission will take 25 days. We'll go around the moon, take all kind of tests. It has 3 tests, 3 test people in it. I won't use another name, but they have all kind of testing sensors on them and everything, because the next mission, there'll be 4 astronauts in it doing the exact same mission. And in 2025, they'll go up, and if everything's right, 4 astronauts will land on the moon in 2.5, 3 years. Now, I watched it this morning, and I'm listening to the commentators, the experts. Everyone's giddy about it, but what you don't see and what everybody doesn't understand is that China has already been to the moon. And if you see this piece here called helium-3, we found this stuff in 1972 by accident and brought it back here. What helium-3 is, it will make oil obsolete. It exists here on Earth, but it's at the bottom of the oceans, and you have to dig for it, and it just takes too long to get it. But it's plentiful on the moon. All you have to do is mine it and bring it back. Quite frankly, you mix it with water, and it creates a energy that is cleaner and safer than nuclear, but more economical than oil. China's already they've already landed and actually brought some back to Earth. Now, we can't really think Artemis is simply going to the moon because we're going back to the moon. Again, this is some great power, antebellum status quo, stalemate pieces. If you allow someone to access something that you want and you're able to prevent it, that's exactly what we're going to do. You hear talk of going to Mars. Why would we go to Mars? I don't know. It takes a year to get there. What's on Mars? I don't know. But if you commit a lot of money to it because the Chinese are going to Mars, okay, do we follow or do we get there first? The moon may seem like some kind of fairy tale, some kind of abstraction, but it's real. And there's a lot of money involved in the business end of it, but it's really a stalemate between us and China. And the further you watch this, the further you'll be able to see and peel back the onion and understand that the Pentagon, going back to that one slide, all of those top 10 contractors are involved in the Artemis mission. Is it invisible or is it subliminal? It's just a part of American society. And the Pentagon, as I stated in the beginning, is the most consequential Fortune 500 company you would never know of unless you dig a little deep and peel back the onion just a little bit. So next year, I don't know if you invite me back what I'll talk about. 2 years ago it was China, last year was Artemis, this year it's the Pentagon. We don't know where we'll be in a year from now, but what's prescient about what we think and what we see is that history repeats itself. Nothing really changes that much, even though technology has allowed us to think things change a lot, but nothing's really changed that much. If you have something I want, I'm going to ask, can I have it? No. Well, then I'm going to take it. Go back to Hobbes and what Hobbes was thinking. And if I can't take it and you don't give it to me, then I'll get some more people to help me take it from you. Or I'll find some people to help prevent you from taking something from me. It's not complex. It's really simple. But I thank you for listening this evening and understanding that the Pentagon is us. There's no other place like it in the world. None. And it actually provides security for the global economy, U.S. security, European security, Asian security, and you don't even realize it. Thank you so much. Are there any questions? Oh, has there been another American president since Eisenhower who's tried to curb the military-industrial complex? In my opinion, no, because he knew it already gotten out of control in January '61, and there was no way to put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, this is a man who lived through 2 world wars, Korean War, 2-term president, saw the Pentagon rise from 1945 till he left, space race, beginnings of the Cold War, and it was the genie was out of the bottle. He just couldn't. He was just giving a warning about how you can help contain it, but there's been no other president that's tried to do that. There have been presidents that have used the Pentagon to do the exact opposite. Vietnam is an example. Iraq was an example. I don't know what Afghanistan was. This is 20 years in Afghanistan. In 2001, you're there. In 2021, you're just gone. And oh, by the way, we left $7.5 billion worth of equipment, workable equipment, in Afghanistan. Just left it. No. You think the Pentagon would be a little upset about that? No. $7.5 billion of military equipment left in Afghanistan when we left last August. That's our money. But it's gone now. It's helicopters, trucks, artillery. It's a lot of money. Any other questions? No? Good? Okay. Well, thank you all so much. I hope everybody learned something, and maybe it will be a starting point to look into a little things a little further. And but just follow the trail. Okay. Thank you.
Production facilities provided by Access Fort Wayne. Learn more under the Explore tab at acpl.info.